So chapter 1, key issue 3, is going to go over really essentially how do changes in the economy and culture occur at global and local scales? What are the 3 properties of distribution across space? How do geographers approach the idea of cultural identity, like gender, ethnicity, and sexuality? How are characteristics spread through diffusion? And how are places that are connected through networks, and how can inequalities hinder those connections? And so we're really looking at how come different places end up to be so similar. So we look at scale always, right? Always scale, which is the proportion of the Earth being studied in the Earth as a whole. So scale we've talked about a lot already. We look at space and we look at connections, and this explains similarities between places and regions that aren't due to coincidence. They're due to these connections, this travel across space, and the diffusion of materials across time. So globalization is a force or process that involves the entire world, and it makes something worldwide in scope or scale. So we have a global economy at this point. So most nations are participating in a global economy. And the globalization of the economy has been created by transnational corporations that can also be called multinational corporations or global conglomerates or global corporations. A transnational corporation conducts research, operates its finances, sells products in many countries, not just where its headquarters or principal shareholders are located. And the globalization of our economy has many benefits. So a global economy means that you can spread the wealth out. You can have manufacturing going on. You can have manufacturing going on in nations where you're also going to sell that product, so that cuts down on shipping costs. But it also means that if we are all connected, we are all affected by things. And so the recession that began in the U.S. and then in Europe with the housing market crisis in 2008, it spread, and it was called really the first global recession. So because home buyers in the U.S. weren't buying homes anymore, sale clerks in Japan were losing money because they weren't able to sell electronics at distribution centers. People in China, an entire town had to lay off workers, and so there was this art institute in a small town in China, and students went there. They graduated from the art institute, and then they were able to work on these oil and watercolor reproductions that were basically sold across the world to hotels like the Marriott and the Hilton, and sold in home goods stores like places like Pier 1 and IKEA. And when probably not IKEA actually, but Pier 1 for sure. So when the housing market happened and when the crash happened, the recession happened, we stopped building homes, we stopped building hotels. That entire town in China, they all lost their jobs. And so a recession that started here in the U.S. affected people in Nigeria, people in China, people in Japan, people across Europe. Here's an example of a transnational company, North Face. They make like those poofy like winter jackets. So you can see that they have headquarters in Hong Kong, North Carolina, and California. And they have manufacturing in Central and South America, throughout Asia, and in some parts in Europe. And most of their distribution centers are here in the United States. When we look at the globalization, we're not just looking at the globalization of the economy, we're also looking at globalization of culture. And so we start to have uniform cultural preferences, and so the global landscape starts to look kind of the same. So fast food restaurants are spread all over the world. Service stations and retail chains, they look the same no matter where you go. So if you go into, the sign for Walmart looks the same in China as it does in Florida. The sign for McDonald's looks the same in Paris, looks the same in Ecuador, looks the same in China. I know this. I've been with people who couldn't wait to go to a Starbucks, near the Opera House in Paris, and I've been with students who couldn't wait to go to a Subway in Costa Rica or Kentucky Fried Chicken in Ecuador. They have a lot of Kentucky Fried Chickens in Ecuador. They have a lot of Pizza Huts in China, just so you know, if you ever go to Beijing. But downtown Beijing looked very much like downtown West Palm or downtown Miami or New York or Chicago. There were Louis Vuitton stores, there were Nike stores, there were Coach stores. The malls had a lot of the same shops. And so bigger, more, like urban areas, more metropolitan areas, look very much the same no matter where you are in the world now. And that's a byproduct of globalization. So here's a picture of McDonald's sign in China and in Dubai. So how are these things spread out, and how do we end up passing on these traits? And so first we look at space. Space refers to the physical gap or interval between two objects. And so we want to understand how far apart things are. So space matters. And within space, how are things arranged? And that's called its distribution. So when we look at distribution, we look at density, the frequency something occurs. So how many things are in that space? Concentration, how are they spread? Are they clustered together or are they dispersed far apart? And pattern, is there a geometric arrangement? So if you look at these neighborhoods, this one here has a lower density, right? There's less houses and they're dispersed pretty evenly. The second residential plan here has a higher density. There's more houses in the same amount of space. But they're also dispersed pretty evenly, right? But if you look at this area here, this residential plan has the same number of houses, so they have the same density, but this one has a clustered distribution. So they're kind of smushed in closer together. These houses would have smaller yards, but maybe bigger park space or like a soccer field. Same thing here with baseball teams in the United States. So we had way less baseball teams in 1952 for both the American and the National League, and they were clustered in the Northeast and the first part of the Midwest. In 2013, there's more teams, but they're less concentrated because they're spread out all over the country. This is an example of township lines or like a city that's built on like a geometric grid. So why are these different places still similar? Because we have different cultures, right? And these cultures can impact how we use our space. So the cultural landscape has a way to communicate to people what the accepted norm is within a place. So there are places that you may not feel as comfortable. So have you ever been a place you felt uncomfortable? So, for example, I don't know, like if you signed up for a dance class and you were a guy and you walked in and it was all girls, would you feel comfortable? So different genders use space differently. If you are like a young woman walking through a dark parking lot at night, like you might not feel as comfortable as maybe a guy who maybe wouldn't be as scared. There might be a bar or a park that maybe would make white people feel welcomed, but people of color wouldn't feel welcomed, or vice versa, depending on where you're at. So in this area here, you see a large-scale map. It's showing you Paris, really like downtown, like the inner arrondissements. And this Marais area has a lot of stores that really specialize in dealing with same-sex couples. So you see the clustered area of where same-sex couples would live in Paris would be near this downtown area. When we're looking at cultural identity in space, we're looking at branches of geography that want to understand the dynamics of gender, ethnicity, and sexuality by looking at it through different lenses. So behavioral geography looks at the psychological basis for our actions. Humanistic geography looks for the different ways that individuals perceive their environment. And post-structuralist geography emphasizes the need to understand multiple perspectives. So multiple perspectives means, again, based on your gender, your sexuality, your ethnicity, your race, your religion, you might view the same space differently than someone else. So the U.S. would be a brighter green now, so you could color that in your book to match. But this is a small-scale map, right? So it's showing global perspective, and it's showing you how same-sex couples are perceived in that area. So you can see that in North and most of South America, it's either same-sex marriages are either recognized by law, or some places in that state recognize a civil union. Same thing in most of Eastern Europe, most of Western Europe, and Australia, and then in South Africa. And then you can see there's some places in Central America where you can still or South America where you can be imprisoned. But most of the places are the Middle East, North Africa, and some places in Sub-Saharan Africa, and also down here in Southeast Asia, where same-sex couples are threatened with imprisonment, fines, or death. So the way you would view that space would be very different depending on, if if you're gay and you live in, the Middle East, it's very different than if you're gay and you live in, France. And so you would view your space differently. When we talk about how ideas move or how culture moves, we'll be talking about diffusion. So relocation diffusion is when an idea is spread through the physical movement of people from one place to the other. So if you bring a new language with you because you've migrated with a group of people, that's relocation diffusion. When ministries bring their religion with them when they move to an area, that is relocation diffusion. Expansion diffusion is when an idea is spreading in more of an additive process. So it's being spread from person to person. So person A will eventually lead to it being spread all the way down to person Z. And person A never even had to move or meet person Z. It spread, one person at a time. So hierarchical diffusion is the spread of people from either a node of authority or power or like a special circumstance. And so like fashion usually comes from like higher income areas, right? Like the runway, I can't afford that. But, a few years later, those trends diffuse down to like Target where I can buy them. But like hip hop actually spread from like urban areas, but it was low income urban areas. And eventually it spread out, across the nation and became part of our popular culture. Contagious diffusion is rapid, widespread diffusion. So think like internet memes, text messaging, the flu. This one here, this image here is showing you how the euro, as the euro was adopted in Europe, how it changed through relocation diffusion. And then here's expansion diffusion and hierarchical. And this shows you the hierarchy of the Ford Motor Company and how it spread from the chairman, the president and CEO, to all the different VPs in different countries. This map shows the contagious diffusion of text messaging by AT&T carriers across the country. And the last type of expansion diffusion is stimulus diffusion. And this is the idea that an underlying principle can be spread even though a characteristic itself fails to diffuse. So like new apps on the iPhone and iPad have been adopted by competitors, or like a Big Mac in India is made with lamb and not beef. The further away someone is from you, the less likely you are to interact. So the trailing off of the spread of culture or any other phenomenon is called distance decay. Electronic communications have removed a lot of barriers from this. And so it means that the access to technology means that distance decay is decreasing. And that's called really time-space compression. Just like the change in our ability to travel around the world, instead of taking 37 days, you could make this trip in 8 hours. That also leads to time-space compression. And time-space compression reduces the amount of distance decay. But you can see that our resources are distributed unequally, which means that some places have distance decay occurring it's more common. So in a developing country, distance decay is still a bigger problem. In the United States, we also have unequal development. So unequal development globally, but there's also unequal development within a country. And so the top 1%, the wealthiest 1% in the United States, from 1979 to 2007, their income increased by 278%. And so uneven development isn't just a problem throughout the global scale, it's also a problem on the national scale. But here you can see the GNI, which is a measure of income for developing countries, is really high, right? Over $30,000 a year. The global average is more like, 7 or 8,000, and then developing countries, it's under 5,000. So there's a big difference in how much access you have to technology and travel if you're living down here as opposed to down here. So culture spreads. There's two main types of diffusion: relocation and expansion. Expansion is broken down further into hierarchical, stimulus, and contagious. And globalization and the use of technology is spreading out, is increasing the rate of diffusion.